Welcome into press coverage. I'm Dan Hope, joined by Andy Anders, as Ohio State men's basketball has missed the NCAA tournament for the third year in a row. For the first time in 20 years, since 2005, Ohio State has missed three straight NCAA tournaments, and we are here to talk about that today because regardless of what the standard is for Ohio State basketball, should be for Ohio State basketball, we can all agree it's higher than what this program has been doing the last few years. To miss three straight NCAA tournaments is unacceptable for a school like Ohio State with the resources that Ohio State has. And while I don't think either of us thinks that missing the NCAA tournament this year is going to lead to a coaching change or anything drastic of that nature for Ohio State men's basketball, with Jake Diebler being in just his first year as Ohio State's coach. It's another year of frustration for an Ohio State fan base that, as you wrote about the other day, Andy, I think an Ohio State fan base, probably some of you that are listening out there, that have become increasingly disengaged with this program because of the fact that it hasn't given its fans reason to care. It hasn't given its fans anything to be excited about. And now that Ohio State has missed the NCAA tournament once again, it's yet another year of Ohio State falling short of its expectations and, finishing with what ultimately feels like a lost season.
Yeah, I mean, they had a chance to, at least if they had made the tournament, you sit back and you say, this was a step forward for the program. Jake Diebler, first-year head coach. But now you're just, again, left with that disappointing feeling. It's the same of, the end of the Holtman tenure. You have late offensive lulls in games. Against Indiana, you fail to make a field goal for the final 5:55 of that game, a game that could have all but clinched you an NCAA tournament berth. Then you have to play in the Big Ten tournament first round because you would have had a first round bye if you had won that game. And you go out against Iowa, really tight game the whole way, a lot of lead changes, a lot of ties. And then you have a 4-minute stretch from around 7 minutes to 3 minutes remaining where you don't score a single point. Iowa goes on a 7-0 run and you never get back you never tie it again. They hold on and win the game. And it's these same kind of patterns that have emerged in the late game execution from the past few years. And even some new problems, right? I think one area where this team maybe had an edge over some of those previous teams was you had 4 really good scorers instead of just 2 or 3, but they lacked the depth that Ohio State has had in previous years. Not that they've had a lot of depth in previous years, but it's something that's going to have to be overhauled. The roster, we know Jake probably isn't going to be fired. I mean, Bjork backed him right before the Indiana game. I think, honestly, that you should wait until the end of year 2 to make judgments about his viability as Ohio State's coach long-term, or at least emphatic judgments, right? Like right now, of course, it's not going to be a positive reflection on his long-term viability for the program. But I think in terms of like firing conversations, these kinds of things, I think it's fair to give a guy a second year because he was your coaching choice. Even if people disagreed with it at the time, you got to write it out and see if year 2 can be better. Now, making year 2 better is a much, much more difficult proposition here for this program, because the first thing is you've got to try and hold on to the pieces you've got. I think Bruce Thornton is going to be a high value transfer portal target. Teams are going to be willing to tamper and throw massive NIL dollars. And if I'm Bruce, frankly, for as good of a player as he's been, as much as he's wanted to win and done everything he can for this program, 3-time captain, I consider leaving because it would be a disservice to him to go a full 4-year college career without making an NCAA tournament game. And so you can't blame Bruce if he's going to look at his other options. But that's priority number 1, is trying to keep Bruce. And then Devin Royal, John Mobley Jr., Micah Parrish is out of eligibility. But those 3 big stars you can keep, you got to hold on. Then you've got to have a better portal haul than you had this past cycle. in terms of the results, especially. I think even in hindsight, and we said it at the time, I'm not going to blame Jake for taking a shot on some 5-star talents from Blue Bloods that, those Blue Bloods may not have wanted. Who knows? But taking a shot on Sean Stewart and Aaron Bradshaw, having that high risk, high reward proposition. Unfortunately, it was not a high reward. It was very low reward to those two players. Aaron more so than Sean. There are clear holes in Aaron's game, especially rebounding defensively right now. I think that's clear to anyone who watches. 6.5 rebounds per 40 minutes. It went up a little bit because he had a decent enough rebounding outing against Iowa, which was first time in a long time I've seen him give. And, this isn't a personal attack on Aaron, but his effort boxing out defenders, finding out body on the glass to secure those boards just hasn't been there this year. And whether it's effort or awareness, maybe he hasn't been coached up properly to look for people to box out on the glass. But you watch that Indiana game and their guards are running around him, grabbing an offensive board and putting it back. You can't have that out of your center. Sean Stewart, honestly, I did think took strides as a defender and rebounder this year, never became the scorer that maybe they wanted him to be, but that's fine when you have those other scoring options. The problem is he couldn't keep out of foul trouble. 7 times he fouled out of games in this season, which is just a ridiculous number. 3.4 fouls a game. You just can't have that on a consistent basis from the guy who proved to be your only reliable or at least serviceable center option, because Ivan Ugovan and Austin Parks clearly weren't ready either. So that center position needs addressed. They need to get a bona fide guy in the portal if they expect to have a different result next year, or like some real strides from the guys they have. The guard situation too, it's going to be tough for Ohio State keeping and getting that right lineup in order. Taysom Chapman coming back, but you're losing Micah Parrish, who was your one cornerstone hit in the transfer portal this year. Unfortunately, only had 1 year of eligibility coming in, so he'll be moving on. They need to do a better job addressing that position, because no offense to Quest Glover, I think the fact that for most of the season he was the team's number 3 guard is a problem. This isn't even a guy who was on an actual scholarship for Ohio State. He had his tuition, he had all of his school expenses covered by NIL. And he was, he had he had played high-level college basketball at other places, obviously came in with some experience, but I don't think that's the guy you wanted to be your number 3 option. I also don't think they wanted John Mobley Jr. to be starting year 1 as a freshman at the 2 guard / point guard, because he and Bruce kind of swapped off those roles in the second half of the season. And you really saw down the stretch of the year Mobley take some lumps, take some freshman moments where he was forcing shots, where he was committing bad turnovers, and you expect that from a young guy. But the fact he was in that position is ultimately a combination of bad luck, but also bad roster construction, and not properly addressing, getting the right pieces ultimately to address the backcourt depth issue. Because we talked about it last offseason that we felt like Ohio State should have added more at the guard position from the portal, I feel like. And Jake was betting on the guys that they had, betting on Meechie, and those bets didn't ultimately pay off, sort of how the bet on 5-star talent at the center position didn't. And so this roster just lacks depth beyond the 4 stars that kind of drove them all season. And I think you really saw them hit walls in games because they just didn't have that guy to come off the bench and be a scoring option or to bring defensive and rebounding energy. There was just no depth on this squad ultimately. And if we've talked about it many times, if 2 of those 4 stars are off, you don't like Ohio State's chances on a given night. And that's kind of how it played out multiple times this season.
I think that if you're Jake Diebler going into your second year as a head coach, you have to learn from how things went in year 1, right? So, the expectation that he should have had all the answers in year 1, there were going to be some growing pains. There were going to be some things that he had to learn from. And I think there's a lot that he can learn from from his first year. And I think, starting with, that transfer portal haul. I mean, I've said it before. I don't fault Jake Diebler for the decisions that were made in the transfer portal. No, the results didn't work out the way they were expected to. But, I think a lot of people would have agreed that like Aaron Bradshaw and Sean Stewart were bets worth taking at the time. Maybe as the season progressed, you kind of saw why they didn't play much at their previous schools, why they were in the transfer portal in the first place. But, the talent was there. Development is something that certainly Ohio State's got to look at in terms of how do we develop guys like that better, because they didn't develop the way that they were expected to. With Meechie Johnson, I mean, you couldn't have predicted that he was only going to be with the team for 10 games. Now, I know there were a lot of people that questioned the fit going in. It did seem like the brief time that he was with the team that the fit wasn't working. And so those questions may have ultimately been valid. I still go back to it and say, you're trying to make the NCAA tournament. You bring in a guy who was the leading scorer for an NCAA tournament team a year ago. I cannot sit here and go, why did they bring this guy in? It didn't work out, but I can totally understand the logic behind why they made that move. But, with that being said, to your point, the one transfer who really worked out this year was Micah Parrish. And he was the guy who really didn't come in with a whole lot of attention, but was a guy who had been a high-level player for several years, a good role player at multiple different schools. And I think you can learn from what did work there, too, in terms of maybe this time around, the priority needs to be finding players who are already proven that they can play at the collegiate level. Maybe instead of taking a bet on a guy who was a 5-star prospect who's transferring somewhere else but hasn't done much, maybe you look for those guys who were under-recruited players but have proven, at mid-major programs or wherever else, have proven that they can play at, a high level at those levels. There's no foolproof plan here because we saw, Chris Holtmann do a lot of that with bringing in guys who were productive players, but not at the Big Ten level. And then they weren't able to make that jump to the Big Ten level. But, the fact is, I mean, you can go back from the Holtmann era to where we are now and just look at the transfer portal talent that Ohio State has brought in. And one of the consistent reasons why this program has fallen short is because they haven't been able to find enough high-level players in the portal. They've had the vast majority of players they've gotten out of a portal have been just okay. I think probably the best player they've gotten out of a portal since Chris Holtmann became coach was Jameson Battle, and he had a great year last year. They didn't have enough around him to make the NCAA tournament, but he was like he was an ideal addition, a guy who came from a Big Ten, had already proven he could play at a high level of a Big Ten, continued to play at a high level at Ohio State, but certainly Ohio State needs to do a better job of bringing in transfers, whether that's identifying transfers in the portal or developing them once they get to Ohio State. Ohio State needs to get more out of its transfer portal acquisitions because, to your point, I mean, it's just college basketball in 2025. Like, Ohio State has to be prepared for some attrition from the current roster in terms of guys leaving. I mean, I think even if they made the NCAA tournament, they'd have to be prepared for that. But especially now that they've missed it for the third year in a row, you can't expect that all those guys are going to stick it out for another year. I mean, I don't know of anybody specifically yet who's for sure going to leave, but I think you just have to anticipate that there's going to be turnover. There probably needs to be some turnover. Like you said, the 3 guys you really want to keep would be Bruce Thornton, Devin Royal, John Mobley Jr. Losing any one of those guys would certainly hurt. But regardless of what happens, Ohio State needs to go get some pieces in the transfer portal. I think certainly that starts with bringing in another center, hopefully somebody who can be more of a rebounder, more of a scorer from that position than what you got out of, Aaron Bradshaw, Sean Stewart, Ivan Yagovin, Austin Parks this year. I think, that's probably the number one priority here in the transfer portal. And then, like you said, you also gotta, look at, guard depth. I mean, really depth across the board is going to be important for this team to build in the transfer portal.
Talking about fan apathy and disengagement from the program, it's going to be hard to get the NIL dollars you need to go out and acquire some of those transfer portal assets when you have that lack of engagement, perhaps. Now, don't know what's going on behind the scenes in terms of that, and maybe Ohio State will have enough bankroll from its collectives to do what it needs done in the transfer portal. Probably helps that they're not going to have to hire a new head coach this offseason, assuming Jake Diebler retains his job, right? Like, that was an expense to have Chris Holtman's buyout and Jake Diebler's new contract and these sorts of things last offseason that you don't have this offseason. But you're competing with basketball blue bloods for that prestigious transfer portal guy that you need. And so that is going to be an interesting storyline of, can Ohio State close the deal on the transfer portal assets that it needs to acquire to have a different result next season. And to your point about development, that also needs to. Really, the only area that I felt like Ohio State took real strides in terms of its development was as a shooting team. Like, their 3-point numbers were up from last year, and part of that was a big jump from Bruce Thornton in the 3-point shooting category, having John Mobley Jr., who, his 3-point shooting started better than it ended, but still posted good numbers on the year. Micah Parrish was better than he's been in his career as a 3-point shooter. Devin Royal took strides. So they had a lot of guys grow as 3-point shooters, but it didn't feel like there were a lot of other areas where guys took major steps. I think, like we talked about with Aaron, with Sean, their biggest issues that were issues at the beginning of the year were still issues at the end of the year. I mean, Sean fouled out in their very last regular season game after dealing with foul trouble all season. And some of that is the fault of, I think there were some whistle-happy Big Ten officials here and there, but it's also like, you don't get 5 against you in a game because you're doing nothing. Like, you cannot afford to be risking yourself in those situations. So, like, these kinds of persistent issues, I think a lot of fans I know have voiced a lack of a lack of ingenuity maybe in the offense and in the inbounding plays. That, to me, I mean, I don't have the really tactical, like, in-depth basketball mind to dissect all of that, but Ohio State chucked one in a critical moment in the late minutes against Iowa. They had a timeout. They come back from the timeout, a TV commercial, full time to draw up whatever you want. They're inbounding the ball under their own basket, and they turn it over. Like, those sorts of things, to me, do fall back on coaching. And Jake we've talked about it. Jake, first-year head coach, there's going to be growing pains. But those are hard conversations that need to be had with himself and with his staff. How are we going to do a better job developing these guys and addressing the areas where these issues persisted for next year? And how do we get better schematically? How do we get better with our offenses so that we avoid these massive lulls of a lack of scoring that cost us late in these games?
The question with the hiring of Jake Diebler was always going to be, is he ready for this, right? I mean, you're talking about a guy who had never been a head coach before. You're talking about a guy who you were promoting from a staff that hadn't gotten the results that Ohio State needed over the last few years. So there were always going to be those questions. And I think now those questions are going to be amplified because he went into last year off of, really rallying the team for, a good run at the end of a regular season, Big Ten tournament, NIT. But you see it a lot of times in sports. There's kind of that interim coach bump. Like when a new coach gets, that opportunity, it's like everybody rallies around him and they kind of find a gear that they didn't have before. And I think they got that for Jake Diebler this year. And I think, at times you saw that. I think, particularly early in the year, you saw, when they beat Kentucky. I mean, they beat Purdue. I mean, there were bright spots, but the problem is, that's been the script for Ohio State basketball. And there were a lot of Ohio State fans that, I kind of heard say it, but it's like when they had those big wins in the middle of the year, it's like they were afraid to invest. They were afraid to care because they've seen it happen so repeatedly in recent years where when it really comes down to it in the stretch run and they need to win big games, they haven't been able to do it. And it's been a recurring problem for basically a decade now for Ohio State basketball. And so, ultimately Jake Diebler is going to be judged on his results. And I think, he understands this as well as anybody, but, it certainly is something that needs to be clear in conversations that take place between him and Ross Bjork, this year, that, anything less than making the NCAA tournament is unacceptable. Like, it's kind of like we talk about in football with, the 12-team college football playoff being a thing now, where, basically the minimum expectation now for Ohio State football is to make the college football playoff. The minimum expectation for Ohio State basketball is to make the NCAA tournament. I mean, you'd like to be making deep runs in the NCAA tournament. You'd like to be winning Big Ten championships. But right now, with where the program's been the last few years, you just got to get back into the dance. I mean, that's step number one. But, that needs to be the minimum expectation. Neither of us thinks that Jake Diebler should be fired after 1 year because they missed the NCAA tournament this year. But if they're in the same position at this time of year from now, we're probably having a different conversation, just like we did with Chris Holtmann when they missed the NCAA tournament 2 years in a row, because that has to be the baseline expectation. There's too many resources, too many opportunities at Ohio State to be missing the NCAA tournament year in and year out and justify that. And so, that has to happen. We'll see how the pieces ultimately come together toward getting there. But like, that's step number one. Like, you have to get back to the NCAA tournament next year. You have to get this team to a place where it can consistently win those big games down the stretch. And I think, year two is when it's really going to be telling to see whether Jake Diebler is the guy who can get that done at Ohio State.
Yeah, and I'll say this in closing. I think I don't want apathy to be confused with incapability, right? Like, Ohio State is and has been capable of having a good basketball program. They're never going to be Kentucky or Duke or North Carolina or these other like blue bloods of basketball, but they've always had the ability to be in that next tier of teams. I mean, I grew up as a kid in the Thad Matta era, right? And I was 8 years old when Ohio State lost in the national championship game to Florida on the basketball court. They made multiple Final Fours under Thad, of course. And since that end of the Thad era, when he got injured and his team fell off as a result, and he kind of maybe lost some control of the locker room, they bring in Chris Holtmann. There's just been no juice behind the program from those days. But I really there's been some narratives out there that Ohio State basketball, because in the modern era, because it's a football school, they can't compete with the other big basketball schools or compete atop the Big Ten, reach a certain threshold. And I would counter by pointing out what a lot of SEC traditional football schools have been doing lately. For one, look at where Alabama's at on the basketball floor right now, for instance, what Tennessee's done. Like, a lot of these programs that are able to compete at the top of the sport despite also fielding really good football teams. And so it comes back to me to two questions. Is Jake Diebler the guy? And I think we'll get more of a definitive answer to that next year. And what is the investment truly in this program from the fan base, from the donor base, from the collectives, all of that, to get them the resources they need if Jake is the guy? Because question one's the more important one. If you can have all the money you want in a business, if it's not invested the right way, you're going to fail. But does Jake have the backing behind him? And I know, too, from knowing Jake, no one wants it more than him. No one wants it for Ohio State more than him. This is a guy who is, Ohio State's in his DNA. And so he's going to give it his best shot next year. But to your point, Dan, I think it should be NCAA tournament or bust. 68 teams is too many to miss that field 3 years in a row, let alone 4. So it's just going to be a very telling year next year for Jake Diebler and Ohio State basketball.
I think the one real challenge Ohio State does have in terms of that, like, investment in competing with the Blue Bloods, and we don't know exactly what this is going to look like yet, but it'll start to become a little bit clearer in the next few months, is Ohio State, we know the majority of its revenue sharing money is going to go to football. Some of these Blue Blood schools, they might give a higher percentage to basketball than Ohio State is giving. So I do think that's the one thing that, like, when you talk about that football basketball school type comparison, I'm going to be interested to see what kind of effect revenue sharing has on that, not just at Ohio State, but at some of those other schools you mentioned that have been really good in both sports. Will it become harder for those schools to maintain that because of the fact that you have this revenue sharing cap for all sports? And the football schools are going to make football a priority. That's certainly going to be the case at Ohio State. But at the same time, I agree with your point. I mean, you're talking about the athletic department that brings in the most money in the country, right? I mean, you're talking about a school that has a student body of over 50,000. If tons of alumni out there. Ohio State should be able to be, at worst, a competitive Big Ten basketball program that's at least semi-regularly in contention for Big Ten titles and making, Sweet 16, Elite Eight kind of runs. I mean, it should be for them to be a fringe NCAA tournament team every year. The standard definitely needs to be higher than that. And to your point, I remember being a freshman at Ohio State during the 2011-12 season, and that was the year that Ohio State football was. They had Luke Fickell come in. They went 6-7, and like, honestly, that year, like, as a student, basketball felt bigger than football because the basketball team was really good. They went to the Final Four. They had Jared Sullinger and Aaron Kraft, and they were like a really fun team. And basketball felt like a really big deal at Ohio State. And ever since then, it's just kind of gradually faded to where it no longer feels like that anymore. I mean, football, obviously, they've gotten back to the mountaintop, and football was always going to be king. That was never going to be any kind of long-term thing where like basketball superseded football. But we've certainly seen it in the past. I mean, the year you mentioned, I believe, if I remember correctly, Ohio State went to the national championship game and lost to Florida in both sports that year. And so
Yes.
we've seen it. It is possible for Ohio State to be elite in both football and basketball, but it's been a long way from elite in basketball for over a decade now. And so Jake Diebler and Ohio State certainly have a big job on their hands coming up this offseason over the next year to get things back on track. Because while March Madness, the NCAA tournament, will begin this week, Ohio State will not be a part of it for the third year in a row. And that's certainly something that is a big disappointment to the Ohio State basketball program and all of its fans. And so lots more coverage of Ohio State basketball to come over on 11warriors.com as the transfer portal movement starts in and out. We'll certainly be following all of that as Jake Diebler works to rebuild that roster for the 2025-26 season and hopefully achieve better results in his second year as head coach. But for now, I'm Dan Hope. He's Andy Anders. Thanks for joining us on another episode of Press Coverage.